A former noble girl who now lives far away from the city is finding a way to buy back her grandmother's property by asking for money from her selfish father in the city. But surprise, surprise, the father is a douchebag and plans to sell her to wealthy old noblemen. Then, a problematic prince appears to save her, or is he? Let's find out. The story begins with a young woman named Erna reading a letter. Erna, who feels upset after reading the message. The letter talks about how she should be a good wife, but she's not happy about it. Sitting on her couch and looking out the window, Erna thinks about how another spring has come. She feels the world can be both harsh and lovely at the same time. Erna thinks about how the world doesn't care about someone's problems. She's sad about losing a family member and facing eviction from her home. Still, she finds beauty in the world, believing that spring will come as if nothing's wrong. Erna also remembers her late grandfather and wonders if he would think she's complaining too much. She remembers her grandfather's assurance that the world remains beautiful no matter what happens to people, yet she feels the bitterness of reality as she must safeguard the house and her grandmother. Suddenly, the maid's call for lunch interrupts Erna, prompting her to join for the meal. Erna composes herself, optimistic that things will turn out fine as she temporarily hides the letter. Later, over lunch with her grandmother, Erna confirms she hasn't met the lawyer but pledges to do so soon. Her grandmother, relieved yet concerned, expresses hope for a resolution to their troubles. Erna consoles her grandmother, believing in the existence of solutions and urging her not to fret. Unbeknownst to her grandmother, Erna has already consulted the lawyer and is withholding the truth. It's then that Erna receives distressing news from the lawyer about the dwindling status of their aristocratic family and the loss of their ancestral home, House Varden, just a month prior. Later, the lawyer informs Erna about inheritance laws and the passing of Baron Varden. Sadly, according to the law, only men can inherit property, and since there's no male heir, everything will go to Varden's nephew, Thomas Varden. Erna, shocked by this news, asks if there's any way they can stay in the house. The lawyer suggests asking Thomas Varden for mercy, leaving Erna feeling uneasy. Feeling stressed, Erna grips her umbrella tightly, feeling uncomfortable about the idea of begging for mercy. Despite her discomfort, she knows it's the only option to avoid losing the house and leaving her grandmother homeless. After meeting with the lawyer, Erna returned home to draft a letter requesting mercy from Mr. Thomas Varden. The following day, she received a response, which she remembered reading at the beginning of this tale. She wonders if Thomas Varden wants to punish them. At least, that's what she would do in his place. Returning to the present, Erna shares tea with her grandmother, noticing how the elderly woman has grown weaker in recent months. It's no surprise, considering the sudden loss of her husband and the impending threat of losing what little they have left to a distant relative. Erna worries about her grandmother's well-being, realizing the hardships she must be enduring. She knows she can never reveal the contents of that letter to her grandmother. Approaching her grandmother, Erna offers to take care of the dishes. She gently kisses her grandmother's head and informs her that Mrs. Guenin Grebe will be preparing some madeleines and tea for her. While washing the dishes, Erna realizes that soon Thomas Varden will inherit the house and likely sell it and the land without a second thought. This realization fills her with unease. She recalls the letter she received from Thomas, feeling disgusted by its contents. In the letter, he offers his condolences for her grandfather's passing, but refuses her request to delay selling the house until her grandmother passes away. However, Thomas proposes an alternative. If Erna agrees to marry him, he promises to treat her with special consideration. Erna couldn't shake off her annoyance from reading the letter, expressing it by slamming a plate on the table. Later, she sought solace at her grandfather's favorite spot outside, trying to hold back tears about her situation and Thomas's unwelcome advances. Aware of Thomas's reputation for mistreating his family in tough times, Erna finds it incredulous that he behaves as if he's her age, despite being nearly as old as her father. Suddenly struck by an idea and remembers her father's, Erna rushes off somewhere, driven by her newfound thought. Meanwhile, at a royal palace, a group of rowboats glided across a serene lake, their occupants chanting together. The noise disturbed a young, handsome man, Prince Bjorn Dniester of Lechen, who begrudgingly noted the arrival of spring as he glanced out the window at the rowers. The prince couldn't fathom why young aristocrats were so enthusiastic about squeezing into small boats alongside other men, despite appreciating their dedication. Later, he summoned a butler and complained about the noise outside. The butler apologized, explaining that the city had issued a permit, making it unavoidable. He also mentioned that more teams would join the event, making it even louder. Despite this, the prince remained unfazed, confident that his brother, Leonid Dniester, would emerge victorious. However, he pondered why everyone worked so hard to make his brother shine. Seeing the prince's discontent, the butler offered to move him to another bedroom, but the prince declined, opting for breakfast on the balcony instead. After breakfast, the butler informed Prince Bjorn of the arrival of the other crown prince. With a sigh, Bjorn acknowledged the news. Approaching him was Leonid Dniester, the crown prince of Lechen, dressed in rowing attire. Bjorn greeted Leonid, expressing his honor at meeting with royalty and noting his flattery that Leonid had hurried over before changing out of his rowing clothes. He asked what brought about the pleasure of their meeting. However, Leonid appeared angry and annoyed. Without a word, he tossed a magazine in front of Bjorn, revealing a cover story dubbing Bjorn as the Royal Poisonous Mushroom. This surprise caught Bjorn off guard. Leonid questioned if Bjorn hadn't heard about it, stating it was supposedly his new nickname. Bjorn's reaction to his new nickname was rather neutral, even showing gratitude for the magazine using a flattering picture of him. It seemed to highlight his narcissistic tendencies. Suddenly, Leonid informed him that Gladys was about to return to Lechen, a matter that made Bjorn visibly nervous. Leonid inquired about Bjorn's plans regarding this news. You see, Gladys Hartford, once the beloved princess of a kingdom, had tragically fallen from grace. Abandoned by Bjorn and suffering the loss of her child, she was now set to return to Lechen, according to a confidential source. The public is eager to see if the royal poisonous mushroom and his tragic former princess will reconcile. To some, it's just gossip for idle minds. However, Bjorn casually remarked to his little brother that the weather was delightful today. In fact, he'd say it was perfect weather for a poisonous mushroom to grow. This confused his little brother, who wondered what on earth he was talking about. Outside, we can see red poisonous mushrooms growing well, just as the prince had mentioned. Meanwhile, at the train station, Erna, our girl, waits for the next train. As she waits, she thinks about her grandmother, imagining that she must have found the letter by now. Erna feels bad for leaving her behind, leaving only a single letter behind to explain. She couldn't bring herself to tell her grandmother that she was going to see her father. She knows her grandmother would have preferred to struggle financially than seek help from her difficult son-in-law. Despite feeling sad about it, Erna is determined to solve the problem. She recalls her father, whom she hasn't seen since her mother's funeral 11 years ago. They're practically strangers now, and she worries he might refuse to see her. Yet, at this moment, Erna's father is her only hope. She braces herself for whatever outcome awaits. Erna wonders if she's capable of this. Suddenly, the conductor grows impatient, shouting at Erna to hurry onto the train. Startled, Erna rushes to board. This incident at the train station catalyzes Erna to embrace her destiny, regardless of the challenges ahead. She understands that the world doesn't concern itself with individual misfortunes, and she must take control of her fate. So, Erna resolves to confront her destiny on her terms. If her destiny involves clinging to even the smallest glimmer of hope, she vows to face it with all her might. Despite all her talk of courage, Erna finds herself worrying a lot once inside the train. Now, let's return to Prince Bjorn's palace, where he sits having tea with Miss Perez, a woman with whom he shares a relationship. Miss Perez appears annoyed, questioning if Bjorn is even listening to her, but he doesn't respond. Feeling a bit drowsy from arriving just before sunrise and not getting much sleep, Bjorn closes his eyes to rest. Growing more frustrated, Miss Perez presses Bjorn about an article she found in the newspaper, asking if it's true. Once again, Bjorn doesn't reply, simply closes his eyes. His girlfriend gets more annoyed and turns into an angry girl, but Bjorn is impressed by her determination, stating that it's not even noon yet, and yet she has already made the journey from the capital to Schubert, looking perfectly composed. Bjorn shifts his attention to the newspaper article. It mentions rumors of a brewing relationship between the couple, despite the husband's past misdeeds. While it wouldn't be wise for Princess Gladys to forgive her husband, who has done something terrible, she is supposedly tempted by his softer side. As a result, it's expected that this summer will be an eventful one for Lechen's high society. After reading the article, Bjorn nonchalantly drops the paper onto the table, seemingly unaffected by any potential issues it may raise. His girlfriend becomes upset once more, demanding an explanation from Bjorn. She suggests ending their relationship, unable to find a reason to continue. especially since she expects to be engaged before spring ends. Despite her frustration, Bjorn remains composed. He's not one to become fixated on a woman, calmly savoring his tea while Miss Perez is visibly annoyed that he doesn't seem to care. Bjorn sees Miss Perez as the perfect combination of elegance and straightforwardness, acknowledging that she's not a bad person. They both understood their relationship was casual, expecting to part ways eventually. But that was before she stormed in, upset over a mere tabloid article. Bjorn sighed and offered his congratulations to Miss Perez on her engagement. This declaration angered her, questioned on how he could say such words to her. Bjorn defended himself, noting that she was the one who initiated the breakup, and he merely accepted it. His response caught Ms. Perez off guard. Bjorn found the conversation tedious. Despite the girl's attempts to stop him and ask for more, Bjorn noticed her teetering on the brink of tears. He bowed sincerely, wishing her well and hoping she would become an outstanding countess someday. This leaves her speechless, realizing their relationship has truly ended. Bjorn exited the room, leaving her behind. Heading to his room, Bjorn was followed by the head maid, who informed him he needed to go to the train station immediately. Confused, he asked why, and she revealed that the queen would soon be arriving. Bjorn panicked slightly, realizing he had forgotten about his scheduled meeting with the queen. The head maid reminded him that the queen had been invited to the charity ball for the royal hospital that night, and it was his duty to escort her. With that, Bjorn hurried to prepare himself. Meanwhile, Erna remained on the crowded train, feeling like she might be squished to death given how packed it was. Judging from the congestion, she guessed they must be nearing Schubert. Peeking out of the window, Erna observed the bustling and confusing scenery, which started to overwhelm her. She tried to calm herself and blend in, feeling out of place as she wasn't accustomed to this environment, having been raised in another city. Determined to find her way around, Erna prepared herself as the train finally came to a stop, marking her arrival in the city of Schubert. Feeling nervous and anxious about meeting her father, Erna's emotions ran high. Upon arriving at the train station, Erna found herself bewildered by the immense crowd and was unsure of what was happening. She felt trapped and couldn't discern a way out, as she was being pushed further away from the entrance. Meanwhile, Bjorn and the royal guards were lined up for a red carpet. Observing the excitement of the people around her, Erna couldn't help but wonder who they were all eagerly waiting to meet. In her attempt to escape the crowd, Erna was inadvertently pushed right in front of the prince. Mesmerized by the prince's striking appearance, Erna couldn't take her eyes off him. The prince noticed her presence, but the royal guards quickly intervened, instructing Erna to step back and move aside. Despite the interruption, the prince couldn't help but notice Erna's distinct attire, consisting of multiple layers of lace. He found her outfit to be outdated and jokingly pondered if she had stepped out of another century. In the midst of the crowd, an elderly man expressed his irritation and jealousy, questioning why everyone was gathered around as if the prince was someone extraordinary. He complained that the prince was merely the prodigal son, the troublemaker of the royal family. Erna felt nervous, fearing the consequences if the prince overheard the old man's remarks. Much to her surprise, the prince did hear that, causing the old man to flinch. In such situations, it was always advisable not to make eye contact with someone who had annoyed someone of higher status. Instead of reacting with anger, the prince simply smiled at the old man, which caused him to blush like a little girl. Erna was impressed by the prince's dignified response, smiling despite the potentially disrespectful comments from the old man. She couldn't help but admire how poised and composed he appeared, finding the interaction rather remarkable. We can see the old man still blushing and probably becomes gay for the prince. As nightfall descended, Erna found herself still wandering the streets in search of her father's house. The confusing layout of the area only added to her worries, especially as the sun had already set, making it increasingly challenging to navigate. After some time of walking and searching, she came across a fountain where she decided to take a much-needed break. Sitting by the fountain, Erna pondered her next steps, realizing that her journey had begun on a difficult note. Her thoughts turned to her grandmother, and she remembered that the dress she wore had been lovingly crafted by her. It was Erna's favorite muslin dress. Despite her initial aim not being to make a favorable impression on her father, Erna understood the importance of comparing herself to a well-mannered lady in his presence. Recollections of her grandmother's teachings about poise, grace, and the conduct befitting a lady flooded her mind. With a determined expression on her face and a sense of pride in her practiced manners, Erna steeled herself to confront her father. Though her last name may be Hardy, she had not been raised by the elegant Duchess Varden. As Erna glanced around, she was captivated by the stunning streetlights illuminating Schuber City at night. The beauty of the city filled her with a sense of wonder. She realized that this was one of the charms Schuber City had to offer. Suddenly, she noticed that time was slipping away, prompting her to quicken her pace. Gathering her resolve, she pressed on until she finally reached her father's house. Meanwhile, at the banquet, Bjorn's sister, Haney, called out to him. She expressed her frustration, stating that although he was her brother, she couldn't comprehend him. Bjorn, as usual, remained silent. Haney continued, mentioning Gladys's impending return and questioning if Bjorn understood the significance. Without a response from him, she speculated that perhaps it meant an unlucky summer lay ahead. This infuriated his younger sister, who demanded to know what was wrong with him. She questioned how he could speak about Gladys in such a manner, considering how he had hurt and abandoned her. Bjorn simply listened to his sister's complaints. Memories of seeing Gladys in tears and hearing her cries echoed in Bjorn's mind. He remembered her asking how he could be so cruel, but he remained silent. His sister insisted that her concern wasn't merely because of her friendship with Gladys. She urged Bjorn to try to make amends. After enduring his sister's persistence, Bjorn's tone grew intimidating as he addressed her by her title, Duchess Haney. His words made her flinch in response. He informed her that the Duke was inquiring about his missing wife and instructed her to return to her husband. He pleaded for some respite, asking them to ease up on him and allow him some peace. Later, a couple of men called out to Bjorn, inviting him to join them for a drink. Observing that one of the men appeared downcast, Bjorn inquired about the cause of his distress. The other friend, named Peter, revealed that the source of his friend's sorrow stemmed from a failed investment. It seemed that he had put his money into foreign bonds that ultimately turned out to be a scam. Upon hearing this, Bjorn's interest was piqued, prompting Peter to express his appreciation for Bjorn's decision not to invest. This jogged Bjorn's memory of a time when Peter had attempted to persuade him to join the investment as well. If Bjorn hadn't been a prince, Peter would have likely punched him back then. However, it turned out that Bjorn's advice was correct all along. Peter mentioned that the steel company Bjorn recommended for investment had indeed yielded significant returns. Bjorn, modestly deflecting the credit, joked that it wasn't him, but rather Peter's exceptional bargaining skills that had led to success. He even humorously remarked that Peter's persuasive abilities were so impressive that he could convince Bjorn to change the color of his underwear. Peter reflected on his talent for making money, likening it to a superpower, and wondered if Bjorn ever grew weary of having the whole world within his reach. However, their conversation was interrupted by the man who had been scammed, pleading for them to stop and highlighting the insensitivity of their discussion. He emphasized the severity of his losses, noting that it wasn't just a few individuals who had been duped, and implored Bjorn to apprehend the scammers swiftly. Peter brought up the name Viscount Hardy, suggesting that he might be the father of the girl mentioned earlier, a Hardy who had lost a significant portion of his fortune and could be contemplating drastic measures. The prince noticed the name Hardy, but he couldn't recall the name yet. He also noticed the flower called the lilies of the valley, which he remembered were the same flowers in Gladys's bouquet. They had become popular for a while thanks to that. He only remembered Erna from the station, noting her distinctive outfit adorned with lilies of the valley on her hat. He acknowledged that she had made quite an impression, dressed in a myriad of old-fashioned trends. Returning to Erna, who had finally arrived at her father's magnificent mansion, she felt nervous, her heart racing as she hoped for a favorable outcome. Summoning her courage, she reached out and rang the doorbell, bracing herself for whatever lay ahead. And with that, I conclude part 1 of this amazing story of Erna and Bjorn. Now, what will happen next? Will Erna finally help her grandmother buy back the house? When will Bjorn notice our girl Erna? And lastly, what will Erna's father's reaction be after meeting him for such a long time? Tune in next time for the next part. If you enjoyed this type of story, I have different videos that you can watch in the description, and I recommend The Horny Tyrant. It's a good story. Anyway, thank you for watching.